Good morning. Welcome to Kenya News Update today. I'm your host, and we begin with a developing crisis that has brought the capital to a standstill. The Kenya Defense Forces have been deployed across Nairobi in an unprecedented emergency response. This, as relentless heavy rains have triggered catastrophic flooding, submerging entire neighborhoods, stranding thousands, and overwhelming local emergency services. The military mobilization, authorized directly by President William Ruto, marks a critical escalation in the battle against the rising waters. This is a 12-minute deep dive into the flood emergency, the military's role, and the broader context of Kenya's infrastructure challenges. We'll examine the immediate rescue operations, analyze the long-term policy debates, and ask the tough questions about preparedness and resilience. Our first chapter, the Deluge. The scene across Nairobi this morning is one of profound disruption. Since the early hours of March 7, 2026, continuous torrential downpours have dumped an estimated 150 millimeters of rain on the city in less than 24 hours. That's nearly a month's worth of precipitation in a single day. The city's aging and often clogged drainage systems were instantly overwhelmed. Major highways, including sections of the Thika Superhighway and Mombasa Road, have become impassable rivers. In low-lying informal settlements like Muku Rukwa and Jenga and parts of Mbakasi, floodwaters have risen to chest height, trapping residents in their homes. The Nairobi River has burst its banks in multiple locations, inundating adjacent industrial areas and residential estates. Initial reports from the National Disaster Operations Center, the NDOC, indicate at least 15,000 people have been directly affected, with over 3,000 requiring immediate evacuation. Tragically, there are unconfirmed reports of at least 12 fatalities related to the flooding, including individuals swept away by currents and incidents of collapsing structures. The scale of the crisis prompted an urgent response from the highest levels of government. At approximately 9:15 a.m., following a crisis meeting at State House, President William Ruto authorized the deployment of the Kenya Defense Forces. The KDF, the military's mandate, is clear: to support, not supplant, the existing disaster response architecture. They are working under the coordination of the NDOC, alongside county emergency teams, the National Police Service, the Kenya Red Cross, and other agencies. The primary mission is search and rescue. KDF units, equipped with high-capacity trucks, inflatable boats, and specialized personnel, are focusing on the most critically affected zones. Their objectives are threefold. First, to evacuate residents trapped in flooded homes. Second, to assist stranded motorists on major thoroughfares. And third, to provide logistical support for the distribution of emergency supplies, including food, clean water, and medical kits to temporary shelters that have been established in schools and community halls. Let's look at the operational breakdown. The military has committed significant assets to this domestic emergency. According to a briefing from the Ministry of Defense, the deployment includes approximately 800 personnel from the Kenya Army's engineering and transport battalions. They are supported by a fleet of 50 heavy-duty military trucks and 25 tactical vehicles capable of navigating deep water. The Kenya Air Force is on standby with helicopters for aerial reconnaissance and potential medical evacuations, though current weather conditions have limited their immediate use. This domestic deployment of the military is a powerful reminder of its dual role. As defined, a military is a heavily armed, highly organized force primarily intended for warfare and the defense of the state. But increasingly, modern militaries are also a tool for national resilience, deployed not against external enemies, but against natural disasters, which pose an existential threat to citizens' security and well-being. Now, we shift to our second chapter, the infrastructure debate. Even as boats ply the streets of Nairobi, a parallel storm has been brewing in the halls of Parliament. Just yesterday, on March 6th, the National Assembly approved the controversial National Infrastructure Fund bill after a week of intense, and at times divisive, debate. This is not a coincidence. The timing is stark. The bill seeks to mobilize a staggering 5 trillion shillings over the next 10 years. That's 5 trillion shillings. Its goal is to fundamentally transform how Kenya pays for roads, railways, ports, and dams, shifting from a model heavily dependent on expensive external borrowing to one focused on attracting long-term domestic and international investment. The proposed fund would act as a central financing vehicle, pooling resources from pension funds, insurance companies, private equity, and sovereign wealth. Proponents, led by the Treasury Cabinet Secretary, argue this is the only sustainable path forward. They point to Kenya's rising public debt, which currently stands at approximately 11.2 trillion shillings, a significant portion of which is tied to infrastructure projects. The interest payments alone are crippling. The new fund, they say, will provide cheaper, patient capital and reduce the nation's vulnerability to global interest rate shocks and currency fluctuations. The bill establishes a governing council with representatives from both the public and private sectors, aiming to bring commercial discipline to project selection and execution. Key sectors targeted include transport, estimated to need 2 trillion shillings, energy, requiring 1.5 trillion shillings, water and sanitation at 800 billion shillings, and digital infrastructure pegged at 700 billion shillings. However, critics in Parliament and among civil society groups have raised red flags. Their primary concern is oversight and accountability. They question whether a semi-autonomous fund with a private sector-led board will be sufficiently transparent and answerable to the public. Memories of past corruption scandals in mega projects loom large. The opposition has demanded stronger parliamentary oversight mechanisms and mandatory, independent audits. Furthermore, economists warn that, while the model is sound in theory, its success hinges entirely on Kenya's ability to attract that scale of investment in a competitive global market. They ask, will investors have confidence, especially in light of recurring disasters like today's floods, which highlight systemic weaknesses in urban planning and maintenance? The flooding in Nairobi isn't just about rain. It's about clogged drains that haven't been cleared, about buildings constructed on riparian land, about a stormwater management system that has failed to keep pace with urban growth. The 5 trillion shilling question is, will the new fund address these gritty, unglamorous but critical aspects of infrastructure, or will it prioritize showcase mega projects? This brings us to our third chapter, Lessons from Abroad. To understand the potential and pitfalls of such large-scale infrastructure and security maneuvers, it's instructive to look beyond Kenya's borders. Consider the case of Libya, a nation still reeling from the unintended consequences of foreign intervention over a decade ago. As reported, the country is now effectively controlled by Khalifa Haftar, a former CIA asset in the east. In July 2025, a high-level European delegation landed for urgent talks. Why? Because migration flows across the Mediterranean had surged, with Greece alone seeing 2,000 arrivals in a short period. Haftar's Libyan National Army controls the coastal departure points. This gives him immense power, not from a recognized throne, but from the barrel of a gun and control of a key geopolitical choke point. Europe needs him to stem the migrant flow, granting him legitimacy and leverage despite his controversial record. The parallel here is about the use of force and the concentration of power in crisis situations. Kenya's deployment of the military is a legitimate constitutional response to a natural disaster. The KDF is under firm civilian control. The Libyan example serves as a cautionary tale of what happens when military or militia power becomes detached from democratic accountability and is leveraged for political or economic gain on an international stage. It's a lesson in how crisis response, whether to migration or floods, can reshape power dynamics. For Kenya, the imperative is to ensure that the expanded role of the KDF in civilian affairs remains temporary, mission-specific, and completely transparent. The trust citizens place in the military during this flood operation is precious. It must not be eroded by any perception of overreach or opacity. Now, let's synthesize the data with our fourth chapter, the numbers and the narrative. We've discussed a flood of information, literally and figuratively. Let's crystallize the key metrics. The immediate crisis response involves 800 KDF personnel, 75 vehicles, and a mission to reach 3,000 stranded citizens. The long-term legislative response is the 5 trillion shilling infrastructure fund, aiming to overhaul spending across 4 key sectors over a decade. But how do these numbers relate? The flooding exposes a critical vulnerability that the fund aims to address. Yet, the fund's 10-year horizon clashes with the urgency of today's disaster. This tension is at the heart of Kenya's development dilemma, balancing immediate disaster relief with long-term, climate-resilient infrastructure planning. Experts we've spoken to emphasize that reactive deployment, while necessary, is exponentially more costly than proactive investment. The economic cost of today's flooding is already immense. Preliminary estimates from the Nairobi Business Association suggest losses in productivity, inventory, and property damage could exceed 500 million shillings for the day. When you factor in the cost of the military deployment, the emergency relief supplies, and the long-term repair to roads and bridges, the final bill will be in the billions. Contrast that with the cost of comprehensive drain clearance, enforcement of riparian laws, and sustainable urban planning. The latter is a fraction of the cost, but requires political will and consistent investment, precisely what the infrastructure fund promises, but also what critics fear it may fail to deliver due to governance issues. Furthermore, the disaster highlights a demographic reality. The most affected areas are predominantly low-income, informal settlements. This raises urgent questions about equity in infrastructure investment. Will the 5 trillion shilling fund prioritize a new expressway that benefits the affluent, or will it allocate substantial resources to stormwater systems, sanitation, and flood defenses in Nairobi's informal settlements? The government's response to this flood, specifically the direction given to the KDF to prioritize all affected areas without discrimination, will be a key indicator of its commitment to inclusive development. As we enter our final chapter, we look at the path forward. The waters in Nairobi will eventually recede. The KDF soldiers will return to their barracks. Parliament will move on to the next bill. But the decisions made in this moment will have lasting consequences. The effectiveness of the military-civilian response partnership in these critical hours is being closely watched. It is a real-time test of national coordination. Success will be measured not just in lives saved today, but in the lessons learned and applied tomorrow. The approval of the Infrastructure Fund bill, juxtaposed with this disaster, creates a unique policy window. It is an opportunity to explicitly embed climate resilience and adaptive infrastructure into the fund's mandate. This means not just building roads, but building roads with adequate drainage. Not just constructing housing, but ensuring it is not in flood-prone zones. It means investing in meteorological technology and early warning systems to predict and prepare for such extreme weather events, which scientists warn are becoming more frequent and intense due to climate change. The debate over oversight is not academic, it is fundamental. Citizens must be able to track how every shilling of the 5 trillion shillings is spent. A transparent, accountable fund could rebuild public trust and attract the serious investment Kenya needs. An opaque one could become a source of scandal, undermining both development and democracy. The government must heed the legitimate concerns raised in Parliament and strengthen the bill's governance provisions. In conclusion, the image of military trucks forging through Nairobi's flooded streets is a powerful symbol of a state responding to its people's distress. It is a necessary, short-term fix. But the deeper fix, the one that prevents soldiers from needing to make such rescues in the future, lies in the difficult, unglamorous work of governance, planning, and accountable investment. The 5 trillion shilling infrastructure fund represents a monumental ambition. Today's floods represent a monumental failure of existing systems. The bridge between ambition and reality is built with bricks of transparency, equity, and a relentless focus on resilience. Kenya stands at a crossroads, soaked by rain but presented with a chance to build anew. The world is watching. Subscribe to Kenya News Update today for continuing coverage of the flood crisis and the infrastructure debate. I'm your host. Thank you for watching.